Our next presenter is Joanna Jo Coast, and she'll be presenting the qualitative work that will feed into the valuation work.
Thanks, Bristol. So, thank you for asking me to come and talk about this. It's great to see everybody and actually to meet some people for the first time in real life over the 5 years of this project. So, I'm going to talk about the qualitative feasibility work. So this is feasibility around the evaluation task, and I'm presenting this on behalf of Marcus, Martin, Rocky and Elizabeth, who were all involved in the analysis, and also Anna and Pam, who did the data collection for us. So just a brief outline of what I'm going to say. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the issues we wanted to explore, then I'll tell you a bit about what we did, and then talk about the findings both by age and then according to some other issues, and then I'll just give a couple of thoughts at the end. So in terms of the issues we wanted to explore, so we were focusing very much on the preference solicitation for the PED squall, and thinking probably more for most of this around the full item set. So we've got, when I talk about the PED squall that we've done this work with, it's got items from across the whole of the PED squall. We had some work that we'd already found that had done some work with children and young people aged 11 to 16 from the UK, which was a dental health study that was done by people at York. They looked at best worst scaling and DCE using a think aloud approach as well, but they only did qualitative thematic analysis. They didn't look at the errors that children and young people were making as they completed the work. They found a preference for best worst scaling, and also that children and young people showed greater understanding of that. They didn't find any relationship between age within the age groups they were looking at, and the people who were taking part felt that they would be able to manage between 8 and 10 tasks. So that left us with a number of questions, needing to know about younger age children, and whether they would be able to do these valuation tasks. We also wanted to look at the error analysis and to explore both for Australia and for more general health states. So our question was around how children and young people of younger ages complete best worst scaling and DCE exercises, to what extent they make errors and what types of errors they tend to make, and then also how they perceive the use of the two different tasks, whether they needed assistance with the tasks, and what they thought a feasible number of tasks would be. So in terms of methods, we used a think aloud approach. So this is where you ask children and young people to talk aloud as they complete a measure, and then you analyse it in terms of whether they could understand what they were being asked to do. Usual think alouds look at retrieval, but we didn't do that because this is a valuation task, so we weren't asking them to try and remember different things. Whether they can make a judgment, and then whether they can make a response that is linked with that judgment. We also had a category around struggle, which was when a child or young person was able to do the task, but they found it difficult to get to an answer. So we did think alouds alongside semi-structured interviews with children and young people. We started at age 11 to 12, and then we dropped down until we felt that children and young people were not able to do the exercise any further. So our process started off with introductory demographic questions, so just things like age, school year, health and so on. Then they did a warm-up exercise, which was a task based on them making a choice between bottled water types. Then they were allocated to either get the best worst scaling or the DCE choices first, and then they did 4 of each type of task. What we found really early on was that although the children and young people could do the task, or largely could do the task of the best worst scaling or the DCE, they actually found the thinking aloud process really very difficult. So actually we ended up doing more probing than you would normally do with that type of approach. And a small number of children also asked to comment on other things like what avatars we were going to have. Then there was a semi-structured interview afterwards with follow-up questions, which were around things like how did they feel the completion went, which one did they like, which one, how many scenarios could they do, and so on. So the interviews were audio recorded. They on average lasted about 3/4 of an hour, but ranging from about half an hour to an hour. This is just an example of the best worst scaling questions, and I'm just going to highlight one item here because I'm going to come back to that one later on, which is this, I almost never have problems with worrying about what will happen to me. So that's an example of the best worst scaling task, and this is an example of the DCE task, so sort of 4 items in one scenario versus 4 items in another scenario. Going on to the results. So we had 40 interviews in total. We started off with our 11 and 12-year-olds, and we had 9 11-year-olds and 6 12-year-olds. We then dropped down to 10-year-olds, and we had 11, 12, and 10-year-olds, and we then dropped down to 9-year-olds, and we had 14 9-year-olds. We had about half and half female, male. We had a reasonable spread across the different Australian states. Most of the children were in good health, but around 20% had a disability, and in terms of the task order, that was about half and half as well. So in terms of errors by age, this graph basically shows you the total error rate, which is the blue columns, the best first scaling error rate, which is the orange columns, and the DCE error rate, which is the green columns, and the ages go across the bottom, so 9-year-olds on the far side, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, and 12-year-olds. So that basically shows you the error rates that we found from the transcripts. That's quite interesting. So we can see that the DCEs, perhaps as we would expect, the younger children find it harder, and the number of errors drop off as children get older. Best first scaling seems a bit more unintuitive. So really a few errors in our 9-year-olds dropping off, but then going up in our older children. So that left us sort of thinking, well, why is that? That's a bit strange. So what we did then was we took out errors that were related to the PEDS qual. So we only left in errors that were related to the task. And what you find then is that the best worst scaling results make more sense. So the errors are related more to the PEDS qual in the older group than to the actual task itself, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So just thinking about our DCEs and the error types that we had in terms of the DCEs, most of the errors you can see at the top are comprehension errors. So those were either children not understanding the task, or more often choosing the scenario most like themselves. So instead of choosing the option that they most preferred, they chose the option that they thought was closest to them. And there's a couple of quotes here that just illustrate that. So why did you choose B as best? Because I don't really have trouble keeping up with my schoolwork and I get pains in my heels sometimes. B, I think it sort of describes me better. And then goes on to explain where it doesn't describe me better. When we come to the best worst scaling and the errors in the best worst scaling, we can see that the highest number of errors is around a judgment error. So this is where the children understood the task, but then they made an error in the judgment. And actually, it was particularly around that one item that I showed you earlier, this one item here, about having problems with worrying about what will happen to me. And the problem here was that some of the older girls particularly were seeing having problems with worrying as being a good thing, not a bad thing. And basically that was around safety. So the quotes here, so worst I think is probably, I almost never have problems with worrying about what will happen to me. Because it's kind of smart to have phobias, because you never do really know what will happen to you. And then I almost never worry about what will happen to me is the worst thing, because you should be looking out for your safety. And there's a lot of bad things happening in the world, lots of weird people, etc., etc. And so they were actually misinterpreting that item on the PEDS score. In terms of other results that might affect the choice between best worst scaling and DC, we had a couple of questions in there about which tasks they found easy to complete and which tasks they preferred completing. And actually there's no real difference that you can see hugely between the responses here, except that slightly more of the 9-year-olds said that the best worst scaling was easier than the DCE. When asked this question, the children and young people gave different types of answers for whether they preferred one or the other scenario, type of task. So DCE scenarios tended to be preferred because they allowed them to do a more comprehensive evaluation, allowed them to use their imagination. So the first quote, I prefer the second one or the scenario one because I get to factor in a full scale of which one's the best, like the best and the worst. Whereas with the best and the worst, they could only pick two. So that was around focusing more on this idea of being more comprehensive. Whereas with the best worst scaling, it was more about preferring it because it was easier to do. So best worst scaling was the easiest instead of just choosing one thing and forgetting. It was around having the DCE having too much information and forgetting the information, whereas with the best worst scaling they could just choose one thing or the other. We're doing some analysis at the moment, which is still ongoing, just to see how much interviewer input there was into the responses that the children and young people made, and whether or not they needed prompting. So we're coding it as to how much prompting they needed, and at the moment it looks like slightly more prompting is needed with the DCE, which again goes with the issues around comprehension. And then we asked them about number of scenarios and how many tasks they thought they would be able to do before they get tired. So these ranged from 4 to 50 with 10 tasks in total. Some gave time-based answers. On the whole, best worst scaling, they thought they could complete more tasks than with the DCE. And just a couple of quotes to illustrate this. So the first one's quite a sensible answer. Maybe I might be able to do like 6 or maybe 7 of task 1, DCE, and then maybe 9 or 10 of task 2, best worst scaling. And then the other one, how long do you think you could keep going? It depends if I'm getting money. Like if you're not talking about money, maybe like 30 or 40. So they can be quite sweet. Just in terms of, I think, general implications and then the implications for Torch specifically. So I think what I've drawn from this is that best worst scaling is generally easier for children across the ages. They make fewer comprehension errors and they prefer it in terms of clarity and their ability to do it. And we felt that children and young people aged 10 and over can largely cope with the best worst scaling tasks. The DCE, more challenging but somewhat feasible, higher rates of comprehension errors, but preferred by some because it allows them a more comprehensive evaluation. And it seems that children and young people aged 12 and over can largely cope with DCE tasks, although our numbers of children in the 12 age group were relatively small. What we did find was with our children and young people aged 9, the researchers who were collecting the data really felt they struggled to understand and also to remain motivated and on task. And we also later noticed the non-PEDS call errors started to appear in this age group as well. But it was on the advice of our data collectors that we stopped at age 9 and we didn't go down to age 8 because they felt it was becoming too burdensome for the children. I suppose the other thing just to comment on is that obviously this is by age, and at all ages there's going to be differences in cognitive development, which we also need to take into account. This is more about what happens on average. In terms of implications for Torch, what that's meant is that we're doing the best worst scaling exercise in those aged 10 and above, potentially down the line, possibly a DCE task in those aged 12 and over, but as I said, being aware that we only have small numbers in this age group. I think there's also issues for me that have come up in terms of just being careful about how children and young people are interpreting some of those PEDS qual items. I'm not sure if there's been a sort of more standard think aloud study around actually the measure itself, but I think that might be helpful in understanding how children and young people are interpreting some of these items, particularly in the Australian context where the way things are worded might be different from where it was developed. And I think just generally to be aware that lots of our participants did complete this with their parents alongside, and that is likely to have influenced what they put, and they do need some help with these tasks. That's all. Thank you.
Questions? was just wondering, how did you recruit these kids to your qualitative study? Like, were they?
So we went through an agency, and they recruited them.
And do you think, like, well, I don't know, it sounds like a silly question, but does it, like, how well they answered the question? Does it matter how well, like, how intelligent they are or how well they're doing? Because they're not easy questions, I guess, to understand.
It's a really good question. We didn't have any we didn't collect any data about sort of where they were in their schooling, but it's a good point. It would be actually a sensible thing to have done. To have had that information would have been quite useful. Whether we can go back and collect any, whether we can get any of that, I don't know. Marcus, you know, we might be able to.
We do have the year that they were completing, but we also have postcodes as well, so we can look at socioeconomic.
We could have, yeah.
What about their, sorry, this is my son's just completed his,
The assessment that they do at year 3 and year 5.
Yeah, that's
I've
what I
forgotten
was
the name
thinking.
now.
In the UK, we have something called SAPS, and you could use something like that. It's whether we could get access to that, and probably not, I would think.
if they gave you consent, then you could potentially link it to there. Because it doesn't tell you a score, but it tells you if they're like exceeding expectation, meeting expectation, or below expectation.
Yeah, I think we'd have to go back and re-consent for that. I don't think we should get a consent we've got for that. But it's a good point for future studies, maybe to collect that. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to show some ignorance. The talking aloud, is that when they actually give their answers, when they're talking aloud?
Yeah.
So are they actually talking aloud? They're actually talking among themselves?
So normally when you do this, I mean, I've done quite a lot of this with adults, so you just ask them to talk aloud, and usually you just have a prompt every so often. If they stop talking, you say, can you just keep talking aloud? But the children found that really difficult. So once they've given their answer, rather, if they hadn't said anything, the interviewer did probe on, well, why did you choose that? Which gets it gets a little bit away from the standard think aloud idea. So the normal idea with think aloud is that you're just trying to capture the processes that would be going on anyway without interfering with it in any way. I think here it's a bit more modified than that because they just weren't able cognitively to keep on thinking aloud. They found that process quite difficult.
But they're doing it as a group?
No, individually. So there was the child and the interviewer always, and sometimes the parent. Yeah.
So I think I listened to about 10, and one thing I did notice was even doing the best worst, valuing something is different to just answering the questionnaire. And so there was one who, there's a question around how far you can walk, I think, and he said, oh, that's okay, I can just get a lift. So that was the rationale. So you think, from evaluation, then, okay, well that's rational, but
it's not necessarily what you're looking for. Yeah, and I think that's quite common to do sorts of things.
He's going further.
Thanks, Stu. I just was to pick up on I think it was the very last point you made about the interviews being conducted in the presence of the parents. And I know it's an issue that's cropped up in some of the EQ50-wide evaluation, particularly where they're recruiting from online samples, that the adolescents are valuing these EQ50 well, so it's often in the presence of their parents, and it's difficult to disentangle the adolescents' values from the parents and know what influence the parents might be having on the adolescents' values. Did you have a sense that parents were involved in the process influencing the children's responses?
Sometimes, yes, but it's quite hard to pull out because sometimes it's just like them trying to get them to think about something, and sometimes it's a bit more directive. I think think my sense is it's almost impossible to get rid of it. You know, it could, because even if you do a survey and you say you don't want parents to be involved, if their child is struggling or upset or distressed, then the parent will be involved. So I don't think you can get away from it. I think maybe it's better to be a bit more in Martin's pragmatic line that they will be involved in some cases, and that's just how it is at that age group. Yeah.
Just following on from that, I wonder whether Brendan's got any thoughts on whether you found similar things in the qual evaluation work as well.
Yes, we did. So in the Quokka qualitative work, we looked at 3 instruments using sort of the equality 5RY, the GUI, and the CHU9D. And yeah, we found kind of, and we used the same company to do the interviews as well. But we found similar sorts of things as well. There was difficulty interpreting the items, kind of the same thing about, well, we'll get a lift, or, you know, that sort of kind of interpretation in that way. So yeah, kind of interestingly quite aligned findings considering different methods and different issues. We also explored in the over 12s doing added duration as well. So for the anchoring within the DC, which I don't think was reaching the point of difference. And surprisingly, that went reasonably well. I think most of the adolescents were actually able and willing to trade life years as well within the DC. So we thought that was quite an interesting development from that work. And subsequently, that's kind of moved into the quantitative, but we can talk about that later on. But yeah, certainly similar. Thanks.
Thanks, interesting.